Hi, it's Dave Oates, Head Researcher at FinderMonkey. I wanted to talk today about family history research. More and more people are becoming interested in this from TV programmes such as Who Do You Think You Are and Long Lost Family. People are doing online research, putting their own family tree together, and most people are looking to go backwards with the family tree and find out more about their ancestry and the history. However, people are also using it to find branches of the family where there might be living relatives as well, and coming across people who are in the family who they've never known but yet don't quite understand why that would be the case. And that's leading people to want to find living relatives. So you can use these websites to do that, or at least to identify them, but what you might struggle with is actually tracing that person's current whereabouts. DNA testing has also become really popular through family history websites in the last few years. Ancestry is probably the biggest provider of this service in the world, particularly for people living in the USA, Canada, the UK, and lots of people are doing these tests to find out where in the world their DNA comes from. What is actually becoming really useful for though is finding living relatives, finding people who you're closely related to through DNA testing that you didn't know about. It's helping people who don't know who their father is find their father. It's helping people find half siblings and things like that. So it's really powerful tool, and it's becoming really popular. In 2016, Ancestry reported that they had 1.75 million DNA tests done. Compare that with today in 2018, there's now around 12 million. So you can see that it's growing really quickly, which means that lots and lots of people are finding it useful and finding living relatives through that service. Websites such as Ancestry and Find My Past and all these other family history websites are really good at getting historic information. They're a really useful data source. But when you're looking for living relatives or more recent information, that's not always the most useful place to be looking. There are other online tools such as People Tracer and 192.com, which can help you find addresses for people in the UK. Then there's also many offline resources, and by that I'm talking about archived information, which can be held either locally near to where you live, or potentially more nationally in places like the National Archives at Kew or the British Library in London, although there are some British Library branches dotted around the UK as well. So you'd need to check whether there's one that's local to you. It really depends on what information that you're looking for, but if you think that you have an address for somebody and want to check whether that person lived there on electoral register, for instance, you can contact your local archives to see if they hold that information. They might not always just tell you give you that information over the phone or by email, but they will tell you if they hold it, and you might be able to go in and access that yourself locally. So we've received quite a few questions from you, so I'm going to answer some of those questions now. So the best online tools for researching family history, I would say, are probably websites like Ancestry and Find My Past. They're really good at providing lots of information, historical records, and a mixture of records. So you can get things like births, marriages and deaths are always the place that you would start with any family history research. But then it's also really important to mix that with census records when we're going further back. But what you'll find on Find My Past and on Ancestry is they've got lots of other records that they've added over the years, and they're always looking to add more and more records. Things like electoral registers, nurses registers, the 1939 register, which is a really useful record, which is very similar to a census, but gives you a lot more detail, and because of the time that it was from, it's really useful because the last census that's been released was 1911, and then the 1939 register obviously is quite a few years after that, and it provides occupations, dates of birth, addresses. It can help you link family members together and things like that. So they're probably the best two resources online that you can use. Both are paid for websites. Sometimes they have offers where you can use it for free over a weekend and things. There are some free tools as well. So there is a website called Free BMD, which is Free Births, Marriages and Death Records. It is free to use. It's not probably quite as easy to use as Ancestry or Find My Past, and you'll find the records don't quite come as far up to date as Ancestry and Find My Past do, but it is free. So if you're wanting to do something without having to pay for it, that's another website you could use, but it wouldn't have all the other records on as well. So if you're really serious about doing family history research, then it's worthwhile spending the money and having a subscription to one of those websites. Ancestry DNA or other websites that do the same thing is proven to be really, really interesting. I think the driving force behind it when they started was to tell people where in the world the DNA comes from. But what it's actually been really useful for now is linking close relatives to one another and helping people find lost relatives that perhaps they didn't even know they had, or they knew very little about. So a normal trace wouldn't be possible because they wouldn't have a name. If you've come up, if you've had a DNA test done on a website like Ancestry and you get a close relative match, then there's a couple of things that you could do. Obviously, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to make contact with that person. It's important to understand what the match might mean, because Ancestry largely will give it in terms of being a cousin, and then it will say first cousin, second cousin, etc. Even a second cousin can be quite distant, and it doesn't mean that's the exact relationship. So you might not be that closely related anyway. If you get a first cousin match, that's very interesting, because obviously that person could be a first cousin, but it could also be a half sibling as well. That the match might appear in the same way. Ancestry is very good because it's got the largest database, so if you're looking to find relatives, it's probably the best place to start, but it doesn't actually give you the best breakdown and understanding of the information, which some of the other websites do, but it is quite complicated. But I mean, because in terms of making contact with them, obviously if they're an Ancestry and you're an Ancestry, in theory, you can contact them through Ancestry, through their Ancestry membership. What we found a lot of people have struggled with is somebody might have had an Ancestry DNA test done a year ago and never been back onto Ancestry or logged in. So you can send them a message, but they might never get notification that they've received a message from you and might never respond. So while you can contact them through it, it doesn't always mean it's possible. So if you know the country that you're looking in, then in theory it should be possible to find them. Depending on which country it is in the world will have a massive impact on how difficult that is. More developed countries typically are easier to search in. So and countries that are connected to the UK, where we have a lot of dealings with, so countries like the USA, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, relatively easy to search in, but then also many European countries are quite easy to search in as well. It depends a lot on the laws that affect information in each country. So for many European countries, for instance, birth, marriage and death information is not public record, so it's not something you can access easily like you can for the UK. It will also depend on what the person's name is. Is it a common name in that country? And have you got accurate information? Many people come to us looking for somebody in another country and not quite sure about the name, which can make the search a lot more difficult, but not impossible. So if you are looking for a person in another country, you really need to know the country and then start to look at what resources might be available. Ancestry can be really useful when you're searching for people in America, and Australia and New Zealand, for instance, and Canada, because they'll have a lot of historic electoral records for those countries, and particularly in places like Australia, they'll also give occupations on electoral registers. So if you're looking for a person, you've got their full name and you know what they did for a living, and you look in Australia, then you might find records for them. So just doing a general search on Ancestry for somebody where you've got the right name and an age can really help. And you can the way you can search on Ancestry, you can narrow the search area down by searching specific countries as well. It's also important you can have name variants as well, so you can have a broad match on the names, which allows, if you do have a name spelt wrong or something slightly incorrect, it can find people. Or sometimes even the record itself has been recorded incorrectly, so the information on it is wrong, but it still relates to the right person. So by having a broad search match, you stand a better chance of finding more information. That wouldn't necessarily work for many other European countries, for instance. So if you're looking for people in Spain, Germany, France, for instance, one obvious place to try is the phone books, and most of those countries will have online phone directories available, but obviously not everybody these days is going to be in a telephone directory, so it doesn't necessarily mean you'll find them. But if even a Google search, sometimes you can get lucky in Google an area of a country or something with a person's name, and you might come across a piece of information that helps you find them. When people identify a living relative that they might want to have contact with, the question for a lot of people is it the right thing to do? And the truth is, if it's really hard to answer that question until you've gone ahead and made that contact, because you never fully understand how that person's going to react. What I would say to people is, if you want to find that person, if you would like to perhaps just extend that olive branch to see if they would want contact, then there's nothing wrong with doing that, but it's important that it's done with consideration for how the other person might feel. So it would be important, for instance, never to turn up at somebody's address, because that might feel intimidating or threatening, even if it's not intended that way. It's important to perhaps use a third party where possible, particularly in really delicate matters where people might be particularly upset about it. For instance, when working with people who've been affected by adoption, it has to go through an intermediary process where a third party who's registered can contact the people on their behalf and help them, because some people need counselling and support. So it's important to think about what might be involved in contacting that person, and make sure that you give the maximum consideration to them and how they might feel, even if it's something that you really want, because ultimately the more consideration and care you put into making contact with them, the more likely they are to respond well when they can see that you've taken that amount of care. If you're careless in your approach, then you might get a negative initial reaction from them, and if that happens, it can spoil everything and prevent any further contact. So I hope those answers to those questions you found useful. If anyone does have any more questions, then please add them to the comments below.